Turn it over to my CEO of the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association and Foundation, Chris Schmidt, who is moderating today's program. Thank you, Chris.
Awesome. Thanks, Dominica. And thanks all of for what should be a very exciting panel. I was talking to somebody this morning about the fact that I got to talk to Cheryl and to Norm last week, and I think we could have talked for 3 hours because there's a lot of exciting things that they're doing that resonate with what we're doing here in Cleveland, and it seemed like a great fit. When Operation Metro Surge took off in at the Twin Cities, there was some discussion amongst our board members of, well, who do we know in the Twin Cities that's in the bar world, and who do we know that are lawyers up there that can tell us really how things have been on the ground and what they're doing and what they're doing looking forward. And I said, I don't know anybody, but people in the bar world are super nice. And if I just call, I bet they will be able to help us. And so sure enough, I reached out to Cheryl Dalby, who's the CEO of the Minneapolis bar. I should say the Twin Cities bar. So Hennepin County and the other county I'm forgetting.
Ramsey.
Ramsey County.
Ramsey County, I apologize. So the Twin Cities, and then also the Minnesota State Bar, and so carries all three of those titles. And then also joining us today is Norm Pentelovich. Did I get right? All right. Outstanding, who is the president-elect of the Hennepin County Bar, which is where Minneapolis is, and asked if they would join us today for a conversation. They so both graciously agreed to do that. Cheryl and Norm, let's start with introductions. Cheryl, can you talk us a little bit about yourself and your background and what brings you here today?
Sure. So yes, thanks, Chris. Yeah, my name is Cheryl Dalby. I'm the CEO of Emerged staff for the Minnesota State, Hennepin, and Ramsey County Bar Associations. I've been in the bar world for a long time, worked with just the Ramsey County Bar before we merged staff several years ago. Before that, I worked in a litigation firm for a few years before I decided I wanted to do this kind of work. Went to U of M Law School.
Awesome. Thanks, Cheryl. Norm?
And great to be here. Thanks for the invite, Chris. Norm Penelovich. I was a trial lawyer in Washington, D.C., and then came back home to Minnesota where I continued litigation practice and more recently came in-house where I'm an in-house attorney now and been a part of the Bar Association and leadership for a number of years. And I'm the president-elect. I think my term starts in July of this year.
Awesome. Thank you. And our few usual disclaimers at the top here. Nothing you hear today is legal advice. If you have a legal question, consult a lawyer. Cheryl and I are here in our professional capacities as leader of bar associations. And so if you have questions about anything bar related, I would say the two of us will take it. But Norm is here as a volunteer leader, as a board leader. And that's something obviously we value everybody who helps out here in Cleveland, and the same for them up there. And so he's here in that capacity today. So let's get started with as far as I can tell from the newspapers and from the news, because they've stopped talking about it, everything in the Twin Cities is back to normal, right? Everything is smooth sailing. It's just like it was 2023 there. Is that a fair assumption? No, it's not. That's a trick question. But Cheryl, what's going on up there now?
So it really hasn't changed a lot since a few weeks ago. I think it may look a little different, especially in the Twin Cities, but what I'm hearing is that from folks in suburban and rural parts of Minnesota, that ICE has a much bigger presence there now than in the city. It also seems like the tactics have changed. ICE officers are no longer in tactical gear. They're harder to spot, using some deception that they weren't. Instead of brute force, they're kind of, maybe pretending to have car trouble, things like that. And even when this really is over in Minnesota, I think it will be decades before Minnesota is back to what it was, if it ever is. The economic impact is immense. The Twin Cities had very vibrant Latino, Somali, Hmong communities and businesses, and so many of those have closed. So many people have been afraid to go to work. So many people won't be able to pay their rent. It's just so much has changed and is still changing. It's just looks a little bit different than it did a month ago.
Yeah, no, I would just echo that, that you don't see the same kind of concentrated urban operations, but you're hearing reporting that they not only are switching tactics, but targeting less populated areas like mobile home parks, areas where you have fewer eyes, you have maybe fewer allies around, and it's just easier to kind of blend in or hide and then kind of move in and out. And so, and just to pick up on one point Cheryl mentioned, while you may not see the kind of really kinetic actions by authorities, people are still not going to school. They're still not going to work. There are pleas out in our community, among the business community. Please go out for a dinner. Please go out to a bar. Please go to a game, because we are just seeing, after, there was the George Floyd, murder, and then protests related to that and civil action, and then COVID. And it's just really Minneapolis and the Twin Cities in particular have just taken hit after hit. And so you're seeing the effects of this. And I think Cheryl's exactly right. It will be felt for decades.
Yeah, and that's hard to hear. I was just going to bring up COVID. It sounds very similar to the when the world shut down, right? It was when nothing felt real. It was for the people that were directly affected by those that were sick, or even to the people that were staying home to protect other people. And from all the stories that we've seen from 500 miles away, it's been much the same reaction from the community, is that people feel nervous. They don't even know what to do. And I think that's lawyers and non-lawyers of even people that want to help don't know how to plug in and help. And those that just kind of want to stay out of the way don't even know what staying out of the way looks like at this point. And that's really tough. So let's go way back. Let's talk about 2024. So before we really talk about Metro Surge, Cheryl, I know that the bars up there have been really focused on the rule of law and really focused on efforts to preserve democracy before all of this happened. Can you talk a little bit about some of the activities that you undertook?
Yeah, so starting a little more than a year ago, we at all of the bar associations in Minnesota started noticing that we needed to really, as lawyers, stand up for the rule of law. So we issued statements, we started offering CLEs, we held some big events. We did last year on May 1st, we did a Stand Up for the Rule of Law event that we hosted at our courthouse in Minneapolis. More than 600 lawyers showed up for that, our biggest in-person event by far for many years. We had a retired Supreme Court justice re-administer the oath. Two of our officers spoke, and I've heard from so many members that is one of the most important things the bar has done. And that was just kind of the beginning of what we were starting to do. We did another similar event in September for Constitution Day, and since we'd had a little more practice this time, we made it a little different. We had two retired Supreme Court justices speak, one appointed by a Republican, one appointed by a Democrat. Really wanted to make sure people were seeing this as not at all partisan. This was about the rule of law, due process, standing up for the Constitution. We also at that time offered made an open letter available to our members to sign. We had more than 600 people sign that letter, both at that event and after. And for that one, like I said, since we had a little experience, we made it a fun event, kind of festive. We had a taco truck, some Constitution cookies. We just made it really a time for people to come out and speak up for the rule of law and the Constitution. We also had started back then, like I said, I think each of the associations had put out a few different statements supporting the rule of law. When different things would happen in the country, they'd come forward and say, we support this. We also started offering a series of CLEs about the rule of law. And we noticed that we had huge participation in those. And we would cap those at 500 people, and we would be at the max almost every time, sometimes more people than that. When it was everything from the history of the Constitution, from the Magna Carta to today. I mean, it was, talking about specific things that were happening. So we had already engaged our members in a variety of different ways to get them seeing that it was time to stand up for the rule of law and due process before things ever happened in the last few months.
Sure, that's awesome, and those many of those resources are available on your website. If anybody listening today
Absolutely.
would like to see that, so please go check those out. And Norm, I want to ask a follow-up question to you. One of the things that we struggle with messaging on is the difference in us being nonpartisan and us being non-political. Can you talk a little bit about the rule of law conversation and how you try to keep it out of partisan politics and in the bigger picture constitutional framing as much as possible?
Yeah, and it's an important question because I think, folks who don't necessarily join bars or don't see what it's not a default that everybody joins a bar association because not everybody understands what the purpose of it is, what the advocacy is. And I think what this entire situation has highlighted is, the prior events when we're talking about the rule of law, it is a little bit of an abstract concept, right? It's like it's a consistent system of rules that everybody abides by, and that allows us to sort of function as a society. And so I think in the non-political space, we are talking about it as, it's the Constitution. These are lofty principles, right? And that I think created a good framework for the bar as a focus. We really focused on not both rule of law, but also access to justice. We have a number of programs that are, to advocate for and try to ease access to justice. And that can mean a lot of different things. It could be access to counsel. It could be, actual physical access to court buildings. It could be a lot of different things. And I think our organization sees itself as, really advocating for a number of things, but at core, rule of law and access to justice. What MetroSurge really, unfortunately gave us the ability to do is sort of make a little more concrete what rule of law and access to justice means, right? When you have people being grabbed off the streets by unidentifiable masked agents and held essentially incommunicado in a federal building without being access to counsel, that is not the rule of law, right? We all expect that if you are arrested, you will be given access to a lawyer. And frankly, that just didn't happen here. We all believe that if a federal judge grants a habeas petition and says you will be let out of jail, and not just let out, by the way, let out, not in negative degree, not sub-zero weather, not with no clothing, not with appropriate clothing, not without your documents. We all believe that if a federal judge orders that, that will happen. But in fact, here, what we saw, and then we're able to talk about, is we had our chief judge of the federal district court put out a list at the time of 100 federal court orders that were at that point being violated. And I mean, I think that is a way to really dramatically and in a concrete way illustrate to people what the rule of law is. The rule of law is what happens when a judge issues an order and the order is followed. You don't have the rule of law when that doesn't happen. And I think that we have been able to, that has been part of our messaging is this isn't really about immigration policy, right? Reasonable minds can differ on what immigration policy should or shouldn't be. This is about really core American principles. And then just on the access to justice point as well, this is, and we can get into this a little bit later. Our bar association submitted two amicus briefs in support of two different lawsuits here. And one of the things we talked about is that access to justice is both being able to access the courts, but also victims coming forward to report crimes, witnesses coming forward to testify. And when those folks don't feel comfortable going to a courthouse because, for example, ICE agents are in the courthouse arresting people, then you don't have access to the courts either. And that also expands out to housing courts, right? Evictions, things like that. That's a really important place for folks to be able to go and have their rights, determined. And if you're not going there, you're going to have people losing their housing, things like that. So I think we've been able, I think when we had it more in the abstract, we had a lot of interest among bar association members and lawyers. And as we've moved into a situation like Operation MetroSurge, that has become more real for a lot of people here. And we get a lot of outreach from non-lawyers about, well, what does this mean?
Right. And the national polls validate that. I think when you ask in the abstract, should America have immigration laws? Yes. Should people enforce immigration laws? Fine. But when you get into should parents be taken away from their kids, or should people at work be pulled out of work and put into detention, especially non-violent criminals? The numbers get very fuzzy very fast. And that's what I keep encouraging people to think about when we talk about the politics of the situation versus the policy of the situation. Is from a policy perspective, there's a pretty consistent belief that taking care of individuals and taking care of families, no matter their ethnic background or their documentation, that seems to be a universal American principle that we want people to be treated fairly. Even if people are going to be held accountable by the system, even if they may end up being deported, we want there to be some visibility and transparency in the process. And so, could not agree with you more there. So let's talk about Metro Search. So in the beginning of December, DHS and all the way up to the president basically said we're coming. The real bulk of folks came in, it seems, just after New Year's. And then it was kind of 6 weeks of very intense, and then it came back with Tom Homan and the pullout last week. So talk to me a little bit about how you first heard about what was going to be happening in Minnesota, and specifically around how lawyers what did those conversations look like? I'm sure, Cheryl, like my phone rings when something happens in Cleveland. Your phone was ringing off the hook when this all started up. Can you talk a little bit about that December ramp up, and then January when agents started really showing up in mass?
Yeah. Well, our bars work so closely together that we really quickly, the officers of especially the three major bars, came together and started talking right away about what can we do. And I think we were all a bit taken by surprise by what was actually happening. I think none of us expected it to look like it did, to have the impact it had. But very quickly, both on the volunteer leader side, on the officer side, and staff side, we started talking about all the different ways we could have an impact. So very quickly, the officers, the president came out with statements. We started trying to organize. We had such an influx of lawyers interested in doing volunteer work. We started organizing all of that. Norm and some folks started working on those amicus briefs. We really just were, in the beginning, especially trying to organize different the groups within the legal community to have the most impact. So, like I spent a lot of time talking with legal service providers about what they needed. I know Norm and many of our officers are working with lawyers who could, kind of fight this on the legal front, on the amicus front with those federal lawsuits. And as you said, there were just, especially in January, a flurry of people, members reaching out saying, what are you going to do? What can we do? And it really was trying to get that all together to provide pro bono opportunities and also to provide funding. And we just kind of went forward with on all fronts.
So I think Metro Surge was sort of announced December 4th, give or take. And I'm also in a different capacity. I'm on the board of the ACLU of Minnesota. And starting right at the beginning of December, there was actions by DHS officials against people who were filming the ICE action. So at that point, you didn't have this huge militarized, obvious militarized push. But what you had was there's a lawsuit called Tincher v. Nome that was brought, mid-December, which was basically some people in a neighborhood came out and were filming on their phones, and ICE agents knocked them down, took their phones away, really. And so a lawsuit got off the ground actually as early as mid-December, of a putative class of folks based on violations of First and Fourth Amendment rights. And so that was actually already going at the time when things really escalated in January. And so that was how, sort of right at the beginning of when I think there was probably national attention to this, there was a preliminary injunction TRO hearing at which a judge, one of our federal judges, actually entered a temporary restraining order that was eventually stayed. But sort of I and groups I'm affiliated with, including this one, really started paying attention to this in December. But the tactics really just escalated in January. And that's where you really started seeing both an escalation in immigration enforcement tactics and also an escalation in lawsuits. There are, setting aside the habeas lawsuits, of which I think there's over 1,000 habeas petitions have been filed in Minnesota this year. That's against like a couple, maybe 200 all of last year. There's at least 6 or 7 major lawsuits going on, several of which are class actions, and they're all kind of running in parallel, and they all are very dynamic. So, things got going quickly, but the legal community responded very quickly too, which was, heartening, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think something we talked about on the prep call is the importance of not just doing all of the habeas work and to jumping into the immigration related things and jumping into the specific lawsuits or whatever it may be, but it's also keeping the lights on with everything else that's going on. I mean, there are still people that are in our court system that don't have representation. There are still civil trials going on. So, Norm, knowing that you're a corporate lawyer by day, and this is these are things you care about. Can you talk about how lawyers from all different stripes and different backgrounds and different talent sets came together to find their niche
Yeah,
in
and
helping?
that has really been fascinating. So one, just anecdotally, so again, right at the start of this with Cheryl, I think Cheryl sort of organized it. One of our retired Minnesota Supreme Court justices, Justice Lillehog, on like I think a Thursday, said, "I'd like to get a group of people together tomorrow, like on a Friday when it was bitter cold in downtown, last minute, ice everywhere." And I think Cheryl more than 100, and he said basically it was not a particularly detailed plan. It was, let's get everybody in a room together and let's just talk about things we could do. And I believe we ended up with over 100 people in the room and another, 100 something online. I mean, we had to shut it down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we did. We shut it down that morning,
Right.
saying nobody
Right.
else can come
And so
because
getting in that room was fascinating because we had, you had personal injury lawyers, you had corporate litigators, you had retired Supreme Court justices, you had retired other judges, you had folks from the AG's office. I mean, you had prosecutors. I mean, you had this, you had real estate lawyers. You had so many different people coming together in a room. And to your point, Chris, no one project came out of that, but there was sort of a grounding of, okay, here's what's going on, here's what we know, here's what is going on. And then people got up at microphones and just started talking about ideas. Could we bring this kind of lawsuit? Could we take this action? And coming out of that, you then saw quite a bit of, a lot of different creative litigation, a lot of different groups getting together, a lot of resources, sort of, folks exchange information. And I think what you saw coming out of that was everybody, there wasn't one type of effort. There was 100 types of efforts. You had housing court folks, you had class action litigators, and that has led to, I could take a walk through what it is, but there's, lawsuits brought by, there's a class action of people detained without counsel. There's a class action of refugees who are, there's a TRO to prevent them from being illegally stopped. There is a ongoing class of folks. There's just one that started at school districts trying to get the DHS's sensitive locations policy, which used to prevent immigration enforcement at churches, schools, hospitals. That was changed right at the start of the Trump administration, trying to get that set aside. So I think what people figured out is, I have a lane as a lawyer, I will go down my lane. And then there was a lot of resource sharing too. So I think that's it's a little bit of a diffuse answer, but I think I think with what everybody learned was, we're not all going to become habeas lawyers. We're not all going to become immigration lawyers. And actually, some of the immigration advocacy organizations, people would come in and say, how can I train to do asylum work? And I said, you know what, that's not the most urgent need right now. But if you can help us in housing court, or if you can help us with a habeas petition, we can train you on that easier than turning you into an immigration lawyer.
Yeah, and I think some of the sacred trust that is put into lawyers just by society, it's obviously to do your work, the things that you're most competent at, but it's also when you're at your kid's soccer practice, or you're at your church or your synagogue, or you're at the local Girl Scout cookie sale, right? It's the ability, no matter what kind of law you practice, to help translate current events into something that your neighbor can understand. And that's something that we've really been focusing on, is almost the belief that lawyers explaining the law to lawyers is a waste of time, especially around rule of law issues, because, as you said, it's too vague of a concept, but also, generally speaking, everyone, no matter your political stripes, agrees that things like the rule of law and access to justice are important to everyone. But it's translating those beliefs into language that is useful for, again, your neighbor. and how you go about that. So let's talk specifically about some of the things that you did during the during Metro Surge. And I have these kind of chunked into different groups here, but let's start specifically with CLEs for attorneys. Cheryl, can you talk about the educational efforts that you put on during those 6 weeks, specifically aimed at attorneys in the Twin Cities?
Sure. So, like I said before, we had already been offering many CLEs about the rule of law. So we knew people were interested in this. We were set up to handle these big, kind of broad CLEs. So we started offering those. We organized those very quickly. So it was everything from kind of a broad, here's what you can do at this time to do pro bono work, and had different legal service providers come in and talk about opportunities at their organization and different kinds of opportunities for different people. We had CLEs where it really was describing what's happening right now, because even if you've gone through law school at some point and you're a practicing lawyer, it may be hard to understand what is happening right now, why is it happening, and to be able to talk to your neighbor about that, you have to really understand what's happening. So we had a variety of CLEs, everything from just trying to understand what's happening right now to here's how you can write a habeas petition, to here are all the different opportunities, just a wide variety of CLEs and so well received, so many lawyers wanting to do something.
And I'll let you go on with the extension of that. And so programming that's more targeted at everyday citizens. I know you've done some Know Your Rights programming aimed at non-lawyers. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so, and actually, I'll say in the beginning, we started out with a lot of Know Your Rights kind of programs. And, things like you don't have to let an ICE officer into your home without a judicial warrant. This is what a judicial warrant looks like, all of that. But I will say we pivoted pretty quickly because clearly the officers didn't know about those rights. So it didn't really matter if you were saying, no, you can't come into my home because you don't have a judicial warrant, if they weren't going to listen to that. So we really did then shift from that to helping the legal service providers out there get more lawyers who could help people with these different kinds of things. So everything from helping them do preparing for deportation. So we, offered CLEs on delegation of parental authority and things like that to help people prepare. Like I said, here's how to do a habeas petition. So we really were more, we shifted to helping lawyers understand what they could do to help people in the community.
And what you said with the not necessarily respecting the rights or the explicit laws, or Norman, you mentioned earlier about the orders from the district courts and all of that, and it's something that's been certainly a touch point in the different conversations we've had in Cleveland around this. Is I want people to know their rights for sure, especially bystanders who are filming folks that are in these situations. But there's also the practical advice of, if somebody with a gun is pointing that gun at you and telling you to do something, I would rather you listen to the person with the gun and then come to me, and then we'll go to court tomorrow, right?
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
that's hard, because it feels something. It feels like you're almost chickening out. It feels like you're giving up on America or a promise or whatever it is if you give that advice. But on the flip side, it's there's a power dynamic at play there, and the danger of the situation is so high that we don't want to be in a situation that what happened to the two innocent folks that were killed up there because they were doing what they felt was right, and that's not a good situation for anybody involved either.
Right. I mean, it is correct. It is accurate to say that people who went out and protested and recorded ICE officers were being brave, in the sense of there was a risk there, and I exactly agree with you, Chris, that it feels wrong to give the advice that, well, these are your rights, but that turn. But it in a couple of these organizations, I'm affiliated with, we did have to give that advice, which is, look, these are your rights. These are well established through courts and history and precedent. And if somebody's pointing a gun at you or grabs you and takes you away, those rights will, we have confidence those rights will eventually be exonerated, but in the moment, those may not be respected, right? And so that is a challenging thing. And so we had some tough conversations about whether it was ethical or appropriate for us to, be advocating for people, giving the Know Your Rights training. And again, it was, and it's a good idea to always do it so people understand it. But you also have to understand the practical situation, which is you could be exercising your rights, and then they could be violated. And so, that is just something that any organization that's preparing. I'm seeing some comments, some questions in the chat about how to prepare. And I think one of the things is just to, as an organization, if you're a part of an organization, just think about if you're what you're telling people and how you're telling them, how firmly and what they can do. A lot of businesses around town have signs up now that say, this is private property, no ICE enforcement actions here, et cetera, et cetera. And those are great. And partly those are based on some local ordinances that were passed earlier in the year that, sort of specifically allowed that kind of signage. But I think, we talk about Know Your Rights training for individuals, but I also think it's very valuable for businesses and, businesses for lawyers to provide it to businesses, and then businesses to accurately explain to their employees what they, what the rights and law are, but then also how to you're taking care of people in your business, that kind of thing. You have to be thoughtful about that. And so, it's different levels of that, and trying to make sure that people understand what the rules are, and then also to, bring some common sense to it.
Yeah, and we here have been really focused on the direct service providers as an outlet, as the people that are providing housing or food or medical or whatever it may be to these underrepresented and endangered populations. And how can they be prepared, right? If you're doing a food drive and enforcement shows up, how can you best help your clients in that moment? And again, without getting yourself physically harmed or in any more trouble, quote unquote. I'm a big believer in good trouble, but any more in trouble than you intended to. So, Norm, you mentioned the amicus brief earlier, and I want to let you talk for a few minutes about that. Can you talk about? So I know there's two. There's the state of Minnesota versus DHS, and then there's the versus Kristi Noem herself. So talk a little bit about both of those, and then what the bars were associated with doing for those amicus briefs.
Sure. And so just to sort of level set, so many folks, especially the lawyers on here, amicus at the district court level, it's totally discretionary. There's not really an established federal court process for it. And so what we, as at the bar, within the bar, we thought there was a perspective we could bring to a couple of these lawsuits. So the two that we ended up doing amicus briefs for, one was the state of Minnesota and the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul versus DHS and the officials. And the second one I'll talk about in a minute was an ACLU suit brought against racial profiling that was being done also against DHS and Kristi Noem and others. And what the perspective we tried to bring was that, so to get a little lawyerly here, in a TRO, right, the court's assessing whether the primary factor the court's looking at is likelihood of success on the merits. What we wanted to offer was the fourth prong there to really weigh in on the public interest, because while in a business dispute, whether or not you succeed is really going to matter the most, and the public interest is usually not implicated. Here, almost the entire concern was the public interest, is how are these actions impacting and in the balance of the equities, and would stopping them now cause more harm to the people of Minneapolis and St. Paul and Minnesota, or to the government if they were enjoined. And so we thought that we could offer a perspective from the legal community on what it means to have a rule of law, and how that was being impacted, and then what was happening to access to justice. So those were core bar principles, core bar missions. And we, especially through Cheryl, had a lot of access to information and commentary from folks about what was happening on the ground in the moment that we wanted to share with the courts. And so I helped organize, we got really great pro bono law firm partners on this. And in the first one, we put together a brief over basically one weekend, because the idea was we wanted to get it in. It was totally discretionary, right? The court could say, no, I don't need amicus on a TRO. That's sort of ridiculous. So we tried to get it in as fast as we could before all the briefing was complete, so that at least the perspective was in before any argument. And we were able to do that. And Cheryl put in a declaration where the way we framed it was she went and spoke to members of our community, especially our affinity bars, and then kind of represent it on behalf of the bars. Here's the perspective of sort of the legal community. And I think that was a really important perspective to offer the court because we are a representational organization. And so, I think we put together a focused brief, really that targeted, that led with our mission, right? It wasn't a political statement like we were talking about before. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't really about immigration policy or anything like that. It was just our mission is that the laws are a consistent thing that are enforced and followed, and that people can access the courts. And that actually dovetailed a lot with our public safety officials. Brian O'Hara, who's the Minneapolis chief of police, a lot of the reason that cities that don't cooperate with ICE, and that's a whole separate area, but the reason that they usually cite for that is that when people are afraid to come forward and report crimes or go to court, you have less public safety. It's a less safe environment. And so that really, we were able to really talk about and dovetail with law enforcement officials about that mission, is we all want public safety, and that requires adhering to a rule of law so that people, can expect when they go to court to testify, they won't be grabbed, right? So that was the first amicus brief, and we had a number of affinity bars join that one with us. The second case was brought by the ACLU. It's a putative class action that basically there's a policy and practice of arresting people who looked essentially Hispanic or Somali, right? Minnesota has, I believe, the largest Somali population outside of Somalia, and very, very large Hispanic populations as well as Hmong and others. And they were just, basically asking people, there's video, many of you may have seen it, of people saying, well, you don't sound like me, so let me see your papers. I think that's almost a quote. And so for that one, our amicus brief was a little bit different. It took the same perspective of rule of law and access to justice, but what we did is we got declarations from our affinity bar presidents, specifically the Somali Bar Association president, the Hispanic Bar Association president, and Asian Pacific Bar, I think, presidents.
Yeah.
And we leaned and we got, the statements that they put in, which most people probably won't see because the declarations were filed with it, they're heartbreaking. They're talking about the members of their community and the impact of these things that are having both on them as individuals, meaning people of color, people of immigrant communities, and on their clients. So on their ability to do their practice. And so that one was really, and I think it provided also, just as Bar Association, a really nice way for us to demonstrate the value of being a member of a bar and being able to use the Bar Association and its membership to advance the missions of all of our bars, right? Both the affinity bars, advancing the specific interests of the folks in the affinity bar, and then the larger bars, so the county and state bar association, demonstrating that we're putting out statements, we're hosting CLEs, and we're stepping up in court to represent our positions. And so I think when it just provided a great opportunity for us to partner with our affinity bar presidents, and they put in these statements. They didn't represent them to individuals. There was a lot of fear about putting names on declarations, right? I had this experience because people were afraid of being targeted. But so we did it representationally, right? I'm the president of the Somali Bar Association. I frequently interact with our members. Here are the things that are happening to our community. And so I think that was a really powerful way to both offer information to the court and also for just people here to feel like they've done something and are doing something. Because the number one question, I'm sure, Cheryl, you too, I've been getting asked over the last 2 months is, what can I do? How can I help? And so I think this was a way that we could effectuate our mission as bar associations and also just provide important information into the public record.
Yeah. There's a question that popped up here that I want to address. It said, did at least some of the ICE officers follow the law? Are there good stories? I know that this is such a heavy topic, but are there good stories you heard, or any positive reminders that we can take from the experience up there?
I can't really comment on that. I'm sure that within this, operation, some things were done properly and some were not. One of the challenge, and I'll let Cheryl weigh in a second. One of the challenges, I think, in talking about this is, ICE and DHS have the authority to do a number of things, right? They have authority to do some of the things they were doing. And it's
Yeah.
not so much. That's why I say this is less about politics and immigration policy and more about the tactics. So I'm sure, to whoever asked that question, I'm sure there were any number of things that were within the lawful authorities of the folks who undertook it, and maybe those don't get the attention, right? Maybe those didn't get the focus. Um, and I guess I can't comment specifically on it, but I'm sure some were. But then there's any, the documented abuses of authorities, I think, are out in the public record also for observation.
Go ahead, sure.
And I would have to completely agree with that. I'm sure there were people operating lawfully and that we just weren't seeing, but we saw so much of the other. I will say, though, the positive that I've taken from this experience is I have never been so proud to be a lawyer and a Minnesotan as I have been over the last 2 months. The way lawyers in Minnesota have come together to support the communities and support the rule of law and the Constitution and access to justice is, I always knew that was there, but to see it in action the last couple of months, um, it it really is something. There is something very positive that's come out of this for the legal community, I think.
And just to build on one other point there that's been sort of extraordinary, if everyone thinks back a few years to that George Floyd period, right? The Minneapolis Police Department was really, I mean, really viewed as sort of as bad and kind of the enemy, right? And there were many documented problems with that agency. And since then, a lot has changed there, new police chief, different leadership, that kind of thing. But coming out of this entire experience, what's been really fascinating to observe is how, not universally, but within the community, now the police are sort of viewed as the ones who will protect, who actually are protecting against some of the excesses of other authorities, right? And so, like, people really have, and you talk to police officers and the police chief and others, and I mean, there's a real different view of local officials, um, and the service that they provide and the purpose of their being there and how meaningful it is to have law enforcement and public safety officials connected to the community versus folks who may not be. And that's not just to say DHS or ICE, but just it's more of a positive point, which is it's highlighted the good work I think that's happened in Minneapolis and St. Paul with our police departments, and also like the value and the importance of just people who live in the community trying to make it better.
And I'm glad you brought up the police chief, because I will say, from an outsider's view, I don't know that there could have been a more capable or competent spokesperson for how things were happening and what needed to happen next. It was wild to almost become the overnight star. It's
Yes.
as crass as that sounds, but his approach to everything was really remarkable.
Yeah.
So,
And I think that's been reflected here. Yeah. Good.
yeah, so I'm going to jump ahead and lump a few of the questions in here together with my last one on your list, and that's Columbus, Ohio has the second biggest Somali population after Minneapolis. Springfield, Ohio has one of the largest Haitian populations. Infamously, they're eating the dogs and eating the cats from the debates. So we have some pockets. There are no indication that Cleveland is on the list, but there certainly is fear around the state that other places could be a suspect to a surge like you saw in Minneapolis. What can lawyers be doing? I mean, it's both looking back at what you did and what worked the best, but also maybe what you wish you would have done leading up to this. How can we best prepare ourselves and prepare our communities if something like this should happen?
Joe,
I mean, yeah, sure. There are two things I can think of that I kind of wish we had been more prepared for. And one of those is really, I thought we had a pretty good network of legal service providers and pro bono opportunities and all that. And now I see where the holes are. And I do think and one thing we're working on now is really strengthening that so that if something happens again in the future, we have more of a better way of matching volunteers with experiences of kind of taking the load off those legal service providers and not making them do all of the intake and manage the huge influx of volunteers. So kind of the organized bar stepping into that space and helping with all of that. And then on the other, And at the same time, making sure, as I think someone mentioned earlier, that we are still covering the basic needs people have, landlord-tenant law, family law, all those things. I think uh, we did shift so many of our volunteer resources into immigration that now we are seeing um, how even more desperate the need is for people doing those kind of bread and butter kind of legal services. And then the second part, I think, is doing the same thing about coalition building around funding for legal services. What we've really discovered is there are the bar foundations, there are law firm foundations, community foundations, all of these groups wanting to give money, but it is not coordinated enough to really get the money where it needs to be in the moment. So those are two things that we're going to keep working on to and that I wish we'd had in place earlier. But those are the things I would work on is coordinating all those efforts before you really need them to be coordinated.
You bet.
Cheryl covered some of the sort of strategic, sort of big picture. I'll offer a couple of tactical points. Habeas, one of the biggest needs and really most effective in terms of sort of immediate impact, but also important is habeas, right? You can train somebody how to bring a habeas petition and how to litigate that very quickly. And that was something that we just saw like a, 1,000% spike in. And so I think that's something tactical that, in a terms of a sort of bar training, thing like that, like you can train somebody how to do a habeas petition pretty quickly. And then get people, connected to the places that they can do that, line it up right away. Related to that, I think we are seeing that you're seeing now that I believe it's the first two contempt orders against a federal official since this administration started have both had Minnesota. There's now one of our federal judges found a DOJ lawyer in contempt, fined him $500 a day until he returned some documents. And another judge here just found DHS in contempt and ordered them to pay for a plane ticket. Judges here really, really were unhappy when their habeas orders were not followed. And so I think bringing contempt motions, I mean, I know lawyers are always hesitant to bring those kind of motions because it feels extreme and but in situations where you have court orders being, just totally ignored, bringing contempt motions especially in habeas situations where somebody's just not let out of jail has been meaningful. And it's also been a good sort of messaging and public safety issue. And then the other thing I would say is it is difficult even for immigration and criminal practitioners to separate out, talking about criminal and immigration issues, and they're different, right? Immigration enforcement is a civil enforcement issue. Criminal is something different. And there's all this talk that conflates that just warrants, right? Administrative, judicial, what does it mean? What do they look like? And they do have different legal effects. And so I do think that, again, at a tactical level, trying to raise public understanding of, the judicial warrant issued by a judge gives certain rights. An administrative warrant is this like internal document that, and that's a lawyerly thing, but it does matter because, and it falls under sort of know your rights, but it's also for businesses. And I think it's really important because this is a thing that gets conflated and mixed together. And it's really hard to talk about the difference between the two, but it does matter and it has different legal effects. So I would say those kind of, habeas, bring contempt motions, understand judicial versus administrative warrants, just core to these kind of operations.
That's great. A question that came in from the president of our bar, Nick DiCello, that I want to jump to. As we all know, that bar associations are diverse places with lots of people with lots of different opinions, especially when it comes to something like politics, and lots of different allegiances and alliances and people who have worked on both sides of the aisle. Did you get any pushback or dissent around activities that have been taken on? And if so, how did you handle that? How do you navigate those waters when you're also navigating everything else that's going on that we've been talking about?
Yeah. We've had a very small number of lawyers reach out, unhappy that we are, for example, offering a particular CLE or an article in our magazine or just some of the statements, some of the different things we've done. I will say it's a very small number, but what we have, my tactic without those is I just call the person and we chat about it. And and I really just keep pointing out that this is not partisan. This is about the rule of law, Constitution, the access to justice, and
Yeah.
just have those conversations. And often we can find that we actually agree on some of the underlying points, and we can respectfully disagree about some others. But there really have been very few people.
Yeah, and I would say as when we were writing the public statements we've made and the amicus briefs, we were mindful that there are, again, we don't, it actually wasn't necessary to use particularly fiery rhetoric or to ground it in any political position, because what we were really advocating for was just a baseline of compliance with the law. And the unfortunately, events sort of spoke for themselves. I mean, it was unfortunately not difficult to identify examples of the kinds of problems we were talking about, and it didn't require doing anything other than just citing a particular news article or putting in a statement from somebody about an experience they had. So I personally didn't get almost any pushback on it. Some affinity groups, really the pushback we got was some affinity groups were concerned about taking a public stance and then being targeted. And so that was really one of the things. And we tried to be very mindful of that. There were some groups who did not sign on, not because they didn't support what we were doing, but because they were so afraid that would cause them to be targeted that they just wanted to step back, which in and of itself is its own form of chilling of speech, I think.
Yeah. And we joke that we have 5,000 members and 12,000 opinions, right? And so it's
Right.
that's part of it is just the nature of the beast when you bring together a bunch of smart and qualified people like lawyers, especially people who are good at putting words together and making their arguments, that it sometimes, it's good to have pushback. And we've seen this, on our side, again, same with you, Cheryl, very small number, not many. But we also have had a very small number on the other extreme saying, when are you going to get off your butts and do something? Like, you're not doing enough. You're not going far enough. You should be out on the streets with a bullhorn leading the rally
Yes.
yourselves. And so, Cheryl, can you talk about where that line is, right?
Yeah, and I actually hear from more people like that saying, "Why aren't you doing more?" And very specific, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do that. And then we just, kind of, and the way I always look at it is we have kind of, we are uniquely positioned to do certain things. Other people can protest. People can go to the schools and try to protect kids there. Other people, many different areas, but we have kind of are uniquely qualified to stand up for the rule of law, to talk about the rule of law, to offer amicus briefs, to do, to recruit and really mobilize thousands of lawyers. And we need to stay within that. And that is what we do well. That's what we're going to do. And, everyone else, it's like, absolutely do these other things, but as the bar, as lawyers, this is what we need to do.
That's great. So before we get out of here, I know we only have a few minutes left, but Norm, I wanted you to talk about those two lawsuits that were just filed yesterday.
Yeah. So one was filed 2 weeks ago and one was filed yesterday. So the first one, it's by two school districts and a trade association, Edge of Minnesota. And so just to give a little background, since 1993, I think, various iterations of ICE have had a policy that they don't conduct immigration enforcement at what are deemed sensitive locations, which generally are schools, hospitals, places of worship, things like that. Absent exigent, and to the extent that they are, that's a general policy or specific that you won't do those things unless there's some exigent circumstances or a whole bunch of coordination and documentation. And right at the start of this current political administration, that policy has been reiterated and reinforced many times over the years. At the start of this administration, that entire policy was basically rescinded and changed to at the agent's discretion, whether or not to go into a school, something like that. So, two school districts and this trade association brought a lawsuit that basically to have the policy, the new version of policy, stayed or enjoined as arbitrary and capricious. And the lawsuit is Fridley versus Noam, I believe. I'd encourage people to go take a look at the filings there. I can get the citation in a moment. What's been happening here is you have had ICE agents staking out and arresting people at bus stops. Okay. They went onto the campus of schools. They've been staging in school parking lots. They have been staging at school pickup and drop off. So, as a parent of kids in Minnesota, I mean, there's one declaration that really got to me. Is there's a quote from a kid that says, asking their teacher that if they get taken by ICE, please tell my parents. And I mean, this is not hypothetical. This is happening and has been happening. And I mean, you just imagine that this is going on outside your kid's school. And it's happening to educators too. Educators have been arrested. I mean, there are stories of parents being arrested while their kids are getting on a bus. So I mean, it's really, really terrifying stuff. And so that lawsuit is going right now, and they just the attorneys handling it just filed for a preliminary injunction, seeking to have the policy stayed or enjoined. So that's one, and the idea is that I think there will be other groups in Minnesota that will weigh in on why those sensitive locations are important to remain sensitive. The other lawsuit is something that's really not gotten a huge amount of press, but it was filed yesterday, and it's basically that. So folks may have heard about the Whipple building. It's a federal building here. It became sort of the detention center where everybody was taken. It became kind of this horrifying thing.
Yeah.
A number of faith leaders, priests, imams, rabbis, have attempted to provide pastoral care, meaning go in and pray with folks and do like that, and they've just been largely flatly denied access. And so this lawsuit seeks to restore that access so that religious leaders can have access to detainees to provide pastoral care consistent with their religious obligations. Right? There are different religious groups have as part of their mission to minister to folks in jails and prisons and detention, things like that. And so, this is that was filed yesterday. So just going back to the first topic we covered, are things still a problem here? Yes. And the fact that you need a lawsuit to allow a priest to go in to pray with folks, not to really provide any other benefit other than that very important benefit. I think it dovetails with the sensitive locations issue, and it's also just something that I would hope most people can get on board with, which is that you should be able to speak with a religious leader of your choosing, regardless of whether you're detained or not. And so that's those two lawsuits you'll see moving forward. But I encourage folks to pay attention to the reporting on them because it's important.
And I just heard from a pastor yesterday, and he may actually be on the call right now. The same thing here in Cleveland. It was that getting denied the ability to go see a parishioner of his. And so not even just general ministry, but a very specific situation, it was denied on that. So we'll keep an eye on that. So to end with the choose your own adventure, I'll give you each 30 seconds or so. What's one thing that you want to leave us with? What's the big takeaway that you hope the folks on the call today and those watching the recording later can take with them? So Cheryl?
What kind of building on what I had said earlier is when something like this happens in your community, I mean, lawyers really will rise and meet the moment. And it is, so even in a very difficult situation, you come out and see the community of the forums, the good work people are willing to do. And it does something for the community, and that has been a real value.
No.
And I would say just, sort of like I've maybe been harping on, the rule of law is an abstract concept right up until if something happens to you and you need that rule of law. And so what I would say is that, we have seen people stand up in 100 or 1,000 different ways here. And just to echo what Cheryl said, lawyers play a very important role in that. And every lawyer has their own lane, and whatever, I say frequently, all help helps. And so I think you can take away from this that, when you're talking to people about what's happening in your community and why your work as a lawyer is important, this is why. And this is very tangible way that you can help and provide value and meaning in your community and give real credit to the work of lawyers.
Awesome. Thank you. A few logistic things as we wrap up here. Dominica just put the CLE survey over in the chat, so please click on that if you're taking today for CLE credit. We're going to post this as soon as we have it edited up online. So please share it with a friend if you found this educational. We'd love to have more eyes on this down the line. And finally, we titled this session as Lawyers as Leaders. And I think it's been a true honor today to have both Cheryl and Norm here as leaders who've been on the ground, and I think really exceptional examples of what we can look at from the national perspective of things that can be done, but also how individuals with diverse skill sets can jump into the trenches and help. And so Cheryl and Norm, thank you so much for being here. Thanks to all of you who joined us today, and we hope to see you at Rock on Saturday or another upcoming event. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.